we'll get everything uploaded tomorrow.
Nine and we record these. Our first lecture in our new School of Health Professions Dean's Lecture Series called Skills Beyond Discipline-Based Expertise. And so what I typically do with these is I introduce it, but I pre-recorded the first 30-minute lecture piece, just because when we were doing this virtually, we invariably had some connection issues. So we've learned to just pre-record it, and that way it'll just run for the first 30 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity to have our conversation after that. So again, thank you for joining, and welcome to everyone. Our topic tonight will be anticipating the future and building learning organizations. And I'm asking my assistant friend, Sean Jackson, to go ahead and roll the tape, and we'll talk on the other side in about 26 minutes. Skills beyond discipline-based expertise. Skills beyond discipline-based expertise. I am Alan Lewis, Dean of the School of Health Professions, and thank you for joining us in our session today. You might recall that the last academic year, fiscal year 2021, the School of Health Professions hosted two other lecture series. We hosted the School of Health Professions Dean's Lecture Series on Culture, and we hosted the Meet the School of Health Professions Disciplines Lecture Series. Of course, the cultural series dealt with topics relevant to culture, and the Meet the School of Health Professions Disciplines series actually dealt with really topics related primarily to the pandemic and the role of each of the 6 professions that schools had in addressing those issues related to the pandemic.
My apologies, I just stopped it.
So folks, that didn't seem that clear to me. Did it seem clear to anybody else?
No, it didn't.
All right, I'm gonna roll live on it then. Don't worry.
Here's a suggestion. If you haven't done this, you can select optimize for video. So when you play the video, when you share the screen, you could say optimize for video. Optimize for audio, optimize for video.
Franchon, did you hear that?
Yes, I'm trying to see if I can do that now. Just give me 1 second.
We'll try that for about a minute and work. I'll just do it live. No worries.
Okay.
So we felt like those 2 series were fairly successful, so we decided to continue with our.
You gotta back it up, Franchon.
So this is a brand new series for this.
Gotta start from the beginning. That was better.
Welcome everyone to our new School of Health Professions Dean's Lecture Series titled Skills Beyond Discipline-Based Expertise. Skills Beyond Discipline-Based Expertise. I am Alan Lewis, Dean of the School of Health Professions, and thank you for joining us
in our session today. You might recall that the last academic year, fiscal year 2021, School Health Professions hosted two other lecture series. We hosted the School Health Professions Dean's Lecture Series on Culture, and we hosted the Meet the School Health Professions Disciplines Lecture Series. Of course, the cultural series dealt with topics relevant to culture, and the Meet the School Health Professions Disciplines series actually dealt with really topics related primarily to the pandemic and the role of each of the 6 professions in the school had in addressing those issues related to the pandemic. And so we felt like those 2 series were fairly successful, so we decided to continue with our School of Health Professions Dean's Lecture Series. So this is a brand new series for this current academic year. And the goal of these series in general for our school is to add value to the education of the students, particularly in our school, but also in all the schools and colleges here at Downstate. So the rationale for this particular series, Skills Beyond Discipline-Based Expertise, obviously, each of our programs here at Downstate are training professionals to be skilled in their particular disciplines, primarily clinical disciplines, although we do have public health and medical informatics, which are not as clinical as the rest of our disciplines are. But one of the things that's important to me is to make sure that our students have something in addition to those skills in their primary disciplines. It provides them a level of advantage and to be able to bring to the table some additional skills when they're competing against their peers at other institutions. So this really gives them a competitive advantage that only Downstate can provide. And we're trying to build not just experts in their clinical disciplines, but also persons who will be leaders and big influencers in their respective professions. And I would venture to say that just being an expert in one's clinical profession is not enough to be a leader and a influencer, a shaker and mover, so to speak, in one's overall health profession. So you need some additional skills on top of that clinical expertise to give you the additional competencies and horsepower to make that happen. And I think that we want to do a service to our students at Downstate by making sure they have this additional training and exposure before they go out to the real world of work. It gives them a competitive advantage over their peers at other institutions that have maybe not been exposed to these skills, and it gives them the ability to have more upward mobility going forward as key leaders in their respective professions. A few housekeeping matters before we get going. We will use a similar 30-30 format that we used in our previous lecture series last year. What that means is we'll do the first 30 minutes or so will be me doing primary talking and presenting the information in a sort of didactic way. And then the second 30 minutes will be a time for us to have conversation and to engage with each other and have questions and comments and observations. We will also be recording these sessions. So if you want to review a session again, or if you know somebody who missed a session, the recordings will be made available through my assistant, Franchon Jackson. And we're also going to ask each participant to do a brief evaluation of the session so we can get some feedback on how well the session went from your point of view, so we can continue to get better as we go forward. This lecture series on skills beyond discipline-based expertise will be 9 different sessions this particular academic year, 1 each month. I think the first 2 sessions are actually on Thursdays, as today is Thursday. And I think the other 7 will be on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock via Zoom. All right, so again, our topic for today is, or I should say our topic for today is the first of 9 within the series of skills that are beyond skills that you get in your discipline. Our topic today is anticipating the future and building learning organizations. Anticipating the future and building learning organizations. So at the outset, allow me to please give attribution to the seminal thinkers in these 2 topics that I will use as the foundation for the comments I'll make throughout this conversation. First, we have Joel Barker. Joel Barker, who is a futurist, who wrote a book in 1993 called Paradigms, The Business of Discovering the Future. Joel is a futurist. He's made a career out of working with corporations and companies and organizations around the world to help them be better positioned to take advantage of the future as it comes along, and to also know what the future might hold for them so they'll be ready for it. He's worked with many Fortune 500 companies, and he's very, very popular and very well known. So much of the content based on anticipating the future comes from his body of work. We'll also be drawing upon the work of Peter Senge, Senge, Peter Senge, who's a MIT Sloan School of Management professor up in Boston. He wrote a book in 1990 called The Fifth Discipline. And the fifth discipline really is systems thinking and being able to understand how to identify root causes below the surface of symptoms and systems. So Peter Senge will be our seminal thinker around how to build learning organizations. So let's jump right in and start talking about anticipating the future, the skill of anticipating the future. So while no one truly has a crystal ball, anticipating the future boils down to 4 strategies. First strategy. First and foremost, anyone who wants to really begin to try to anticipate the future has to recognize that their past success means nothing today. So it doesn't matter how good you were yesterday. The key is how good are you today and how good will you be tomorrow. So it's really today and tomorrow that really matter the most. Yesterday is old news and it's history. And an example of this is I'll give you is the Swiss watch industry. The Swiss watch industry, which dominated the world watch industry in terms of its market share from at the end of World War II, around 1945, up through about 1970. So about 25 years, the Swiss had about 50 to 60% of the world watch market. And if you recall, Swiss watches were the old watches that had the springs and they wind them, you had to wind them up to keep them running, and they were very precise and very good watches. But around the beginning of the 70s, the Swiss actually lost that dominance in terms of market share in the world because a new innovation came forward. They didn't really anticipate the future, and a new innovation came forward and really essentially caused them to lose out on most of their market share. And so they essentially rested on their laurels, and because they had dominated the market for the first 25 years following the end of World War II, I think the assumption among the Swiss watchmaking industry was that they were going to always be dominant, but it wasn't the case. And we'll talk a bit more about that with some of these other strategies in just a few minutes. So the second, we'll come back to that example. So the second strategy for anticipating the future is to look for innovation on the fringe of one's professional discipline. And so what that really means is we all live in a discipline. If you're an occupational therapist, or if you're a physician, or if you're a nurse, or a public health professional, you're a member of those disciplines, those professional groups. And so there are people in those groups from the center of the group, where the established thinkers are and the status quo, all the way out to the edge of those professional groups, where you begin to reach the boundary, and at the boundary are where the other professions live. So if any given health discipline lives in a context where there is their own group, but it is juxtaposed and adjacent to many other groups on its boundaries. And so the second strategy really is to make sure that we look for innovation, not in the center of our professions, because that's where the established thinkers are, that's where the status quo is, but on the fringe. Because when you're on the fringe of your professional discipline, you have the appropriate positioning and vantage point to see what's happening in your own discipline, but also what's happening in other disciplines that are adjacent to your discipline. So if you're a nurse, on the fringe, you get to look over into medicine, look over into physical therapy, look over into occupational therapy, look over into medical informatics, look over into psychology, look over into applied behavior analysis, anthropology, religion, education, all these other disciplines, and things that are happening in those other disciplines can actually stimulate innovation for what could be working in your discipline and could be new and interesting. And so the key is to look for that innovation, that is, the creative ideas, the next new things on the fringe of your professional discipline, because only on the fringe do you have the positioning to see what's happening, or the vantage point to see what's happening in other disciplines. Again, the established thinkers and the status quo will be in the center of your discipline. So you want to move away from that center, even though it's good to know the established concepts and theoretical orientations. If you want to be an innovator and a shaker and mover, you want to position yourself on that fringe where you have the ability to look into other adjacent disciplines and be stimulated by what's happening there and have that cross fertilization of those additional perspectives. And that will bring to bear some new innovation in your thinking process in your own discipline. The third strategy is do not be afraid to go back to zero. Going back to zero is a concept that Joel Barker uses that speaks to two things. One, having a low investment in the status quo. In other words, whatever the established way of doing business is or established techniques of providing services, those are great. They're evidence-based for a given time. But always realize that that changes constantly. And being put back to zero also means not only having that low investment in the status quo, it also means when you reach a point in your professional career on any given day, when you realize that all the knowledge, expertise, training, and experience you have is not all that helpful. In other words, you have limitations on what you know for the given situation that you're facing or the given challenge that's before you. And so when you're put back to zero, that means you've got to do something quickly to learn anew, to be a lifelong learner, to retool in the moment, to do some extra reading, to really have the knowledge you need that'll help you overcome the challenge you're facing at the moment. So essentially the Swiss watchmaking industry was put back to zero in the beginning of the 1970s, because at that point, what changed was a new innovation hit the watchmaking industry, and it was the quartz watch. And if you look at the watches that you're wearing right now, nobody wears the old Swiss watch anymore. We all wear the watch that has the quartz mechanism inside, because the quartz mechanism is much more precise. You don't have to wind it up. It's self-running, and it's a much better watch. And believe it or not, the Swiss actually innovated that technology. A Swiss engineer in the watchmaking industry, I think his name was Herzl, actually innovated the quartz technology. The Swiss were so unable to see that that was the next new thing in the future of watchmaking that they didn't protect it. They actually exhibited this new technology at a world watchmaking exhibition. It wasn't patented. They didn't protect it because they were so sure that the old way of doing business, the old wind-up gear-based watches, would be the future of watchmaking, because it had been for the previous 25 years, that they casually exhibited it as a novel, interesting, but useless way of making watches. And Seiko of Japan walked by the exhibit and took it back, and the rest is history. Seiko of Japan, Casio, all those companies now dominate the watchmaking industry. And today, nobody makes a watch other than a watch that's made with the quartz mechanism. So the future in watchmaking was innovated by the Swiss. Their engineer came up with the idea, didn't have the foresight to realize it was the next great invention to dominate the world watchmaking market. It was not patented, it was not protected. It was taken away at an exhibition and was used. And from 1970, from the early 70s on, the Swiss actually had very minimal amount of the world market share in terms of watchmaking, because the quartz watch was the new watch of the future. So they failed to anticipate the future when they themselves actually innovated the technology that was to be the future. And so the key here is you can be put back to zero when things change so quickly that your knowledge doesn't help you, or that your market advantage doesn't help you, or you can don't be afraid to move away from zero, because that's where the established thinking is. So you got to move forward away from the point of zero. I always think about being put back to zero as any time in my own life, my own professional career, that I run across something in a given day's work that I feel like I need to know a lot more about than I actually do. You know, I used to tell my kids all the time that you know, no matter how much education you have and how much background and experience, you're always still learning. And which is not a popular idea to kids, because they feel like going to school is something they do while they're young, and then once you're out of school, you never have to go back and do any more learning. But learning is a lifelong process. And I would venture to say that in my current role as Dean of School of Health Professions, we have 6 disciplines, none of which are my own base disciplines. So on any given day, and on many days, I run across a concept that relates to one of our disciplines that I'm not as familiar with as I need to be. And so I'm essentially put back to zero, meaning the knowledge I have as a dean isn't all that helpful in overcoming the challenge of what I need to know about this new concept. So what do? I've got to do some lifelong learning. I've got to do some learning anew on the fly right then and there. Luckily, we live in the 21st century when we have a lot of information at our fingertips. So it's no problem to do a Google search or to search some other database to find out what you need to make sure that although you may be put back to zero, you don't stay at zero because you learn quickly with information you need to move forward. So that's the third strategy. And the fourth strategy, according to Joel Barker, for anticipating the future really is asking the anticipating the future question. The anticipating the future question really is a question that needs to be asked over and over again. You need to reach consensus on what the answer is. You need to ask it in a pure way. And that question is, what today seems impossible to do in your discipline, but if you could do it, would fundamentally change things for the better? Again, that question is, what today seems impossible to do in your discipline, but if you could do it, would fundamentally change things for the better? That question needs to be asked over and over again. You need to ask it in groups of professionals within your given discipline, and you need to reach consensus on what the answer is, and you have to ask that question in a pure way. In other words, don't think about what's feasible. Don't think about what's cost effective. Don't think about what's practical. Don't think about what you can afford. The idea is to think about in a very pure way. What is the thing that's impossible to do today, but if we could do it in midwifery, or if we could do it in surgery, or if we could do it in the nurse practitioner field, would fundamentally change that discipline for the better? Whatever that answer is, after you pose that question over and over again and reach consensus, and you think about it in a pure way, not in terms of feasibility and what you can afford, will be the future. So you got to ask that question again and again, reach consensus, because that will lead you in the path of what the new innovations will get within a given discipline. So those four strategies really do allow us to, although we don't have that crystal ball, to be better positioned and more systematic and intentional in anticipating the future. Again, past success means nothing. Strategy one, you can never rest on your laurels. Strategy two, look for innovation on the fringe of your professional discipline, meaning innovation will not happen in the center of your discipline where the established thinkers are or the status quo is. You got to be positioned on the fringe where you have the vantage point and the position to see what's happening in other disciplines, which will stimulate you, give you that cross-fertilization to actually be more innovative and creative about what can happen in your own discipline. Three, don't be afraid to be put back to zero, because it will happen, because your knowledge will not, even though it's vast and you're well prepared and trained and educated, it's not going to be enough for every situation. So you've got to be willing to learn anew, learn on the fly, and be a lifelong learner to deal with the challenges that you encounter going forward in your career. And fourth, ask that anticipating the future question over and over again. Ask it in a pure way without thinking about cost and feasibility, and build consensus on what the answer is among your colleagues in your same discipline. And that will lead you in the direction, down the path of what the next new innovation will be within your own profession. Okay, shifting gears, let's talk a little bit about building learning organizations, which is a similar concept, but more to anticipate the future, but more focused on organizational entities rather than disciplines. As I said before, Peter Senge out of MIT talked about this in his book, The Fifth Discipline, 1990 was when it was published. And Senge says that organizations come and go, but those that endure and seem to sustain themselves over the long haul do so by being proactive, nimble and agile, and adequately able to respond to change over time. And organizations that are able to be learning organizations really have the ability where people constantly within the organization, members of the organization, those people who are in the organization, constantly increase their capacity to produce the appropriate outcomes over time. New ideas tend to be nurtured, and there's no penalty for aspiration. People have the ability to see the big picture, that is the macro perspective, and they have the ability to modify any internally held conceptions or conceptual models about how things work. And so they're really free thinkers, and they're willing to move away from their previous thoughts about how the world works. They hold images that are flexible in terms of those mental models, and they have the ability to move away from them. So they may say the world is bad. Yes, that's the old way of thinking about it. Or they may say a new way, well, the world is not really bad. The world is just a world that's based on opportunism, based on capitalism in terms of profit motives, and based on Darwinism in terms of only the strongest survive, or the fittest survive. And so they see the world not so much as a bad thing, but the world that's based primarily on these other values that may or may not be consistent with what they embrace, but those are the values that make the world operate: Darwinism, opportunism, and capitalistic kind of drives. So people in learning organizations understand that the current mental frameworks that they embrace may not be the frameworks that the world is operating under. So they have the flexibility to modify those to fit what's happening within the organization going forward. Peter Senge states that all organizations learn one of two ways. They either learn through adaptive learning, which is learning where you didn't anticipate it, it's reactionary, something happens and you've got to react and respond, but you're off balance. So an example would be if President Riley told me today, Alan, the School of Health Professions needs to have a $2 million cut in this year's budget. I hadn't anticipated it. There was no early warning that it was going to come, but he says it's got to happen right away. And so I'm automatically off balance. I'm in a reactionary mode. It was not anticipated. We've got to adapt, but we're off balance and we weren't ready for it. So we're going to catch it. We're going to suck a wind, and the monkey's going to be on our back in terms of trying to adapt to that challenge that's just been imposed upon us. Conversely, generative learning is learning that's more proactive. It's learning ahead of that crisis curve. It's being ready for those types of things that may come out of left field, that may be unanticipated, but you're always ready and you've sort of anticipated and have taken a proactive stance to the possibility that those kind of things can happen. So Peter Senge says that all organizations learn one of those two ways, but the learning organizations that do the best, that have the most sustainability over time, that are the most agile and nimble, tend to be those organizations that do more generative learning, meaning proactive, ahead of the crisis learning, than those that are more adaptive, which means that they just sort of adopt a reactive mode. Because generative learning is better because obviously the organization is in control and it learns ahead of whatever the next big challenge may be. And he says organizations that learn generatively, that engage in generative learning, I should say, do four things well. They exhibit personal mastery at all levels. In other words, everybody in the organization is expert at her or his job, no matter what their job is, from the CEO at the top to the person who's in the bottom of the organizational chart. All jobs are important and they all are total experts in their jobs. So they exhibit that personal mastery. Learning organizations that do generative learning also have the ability to engage in team learning. So team work and functioning as a team is important. And that most of the learning that occurs in an organization about challenges ahead happen in the team context, where you have that interdisciplinary, cross-functional focus. So the learning is more comprehensive and complete in that kind of context. Number three, organizations that are learning organizations that learn generatively also have the ability to routinely engage in collective visioning. In other words, they focus on vision, they're driven by vision, they articulate their vision, they form new visions all in a collective manner. It's not the executives who promote the vision. It's not the grassroots workers who promote the vision. It's a collective, collaborative process across all levels of the organization in terms of setting that vision, developing that vision, and deciding, how you're going to get there. And fourth, and this is not something that Senge says so much, but something I've learned in my experience is that organizations that learn better in a more generative manner really do a lot more data-driven decision-making. They do a lot of measurement of key processes. They measure outcomes. They do summative evaluation of outcomes and impact. They do formative evaluation of processes and protocols and procedures and operational kinds of things. And they have this culture of using data to make decisions. Data-driven decision-making really means taking a systematic and intentional approach to have the data at your disposal to make the decisions you have to make. The reality is that decisions will be made every day in every organization, but we don't want to make anecdotal decisions. We want to make decisions that are really decisions that are based on us thinking ahead and having systematic and intentionally collected the data to support the decisions. So we'll have a session later on where we actually talk about data-driven decision-making for the entire time. But I just wanted to throw in at this point that organizations that learn in a generative kind of way and are very proactive as learning organizations tend to do more data-driven decision-making and are really focused on measurement and assessment. So again, just to recap, generative learning is the kind of learning we want to do, that learning organizations that are able to be proactive and not just react to things that happen in their context and their environment. And organizations that do that best are organizations that really excel at personal mastery. In other words, everybody is empowered to be the expert in their own jobs. Two, they engage in team learning. So teamwork is a great concept that's embraced, and the learning happens mostly in the team context. Three, There's routine participation in collective visioning. So developing the vision happens in a collaborative way across the organization. And fourth, persons regularly participate in data-driven activities and measurement and assessment of key attributes that are inherent in the organization's operations, because they want to have data to make decisions, and they do that in a very systematic and intentional way, so the decisions can be based on the right data rather than anecdotal data. So the decisions are much more solid, and they can have much more confidence in the decisions they make. So that's the essence of what I wanted to say. So we talked a little bit about anticipating the future, a couple steps for that, and strategies, and then a little bit about building learning organizations. So I think it's now time for us to transition over to our second 30-minute segment, where we'll have an opportunity to engage and hear your comments and reflections and observations and questions. And we'll move to that right now. Another stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks. I assume you can hear me. Yes?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry about all the
Much better.
technical difficulties today. They started early this morning. I've been in several Zoom meetings today, and Zoom has not worked right in one of those meetings so far today. So I guess it's continuing its consistency to this afternoon. So the floor is now open for comments, observations, questions, points of clarification, anything
Yes.
anybody wants to say.
I just want to ask, is it adaptive learning and general learning? I didn't hear the word.
Yeah, all organizations learn either adaptively, which is reactionary learning, things happen and you react to it, or through generative learning, which is more proactive, anticipatory learning. So it's adaptive and generative learning.
Generative. Okay, thank you.
Generative, yeah. And so obviously the organizations that are most nimble and agile and that have the best sustainability do much more of the generative learning, because they are able to be proactive and anticipate things. So they're not as off balance, as often as organizations that are more adaptive in how they learn.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And the other thing that I probably understated in the conversation, the pre-recorded piece, is that in the book, The Fifth Discipline, that fifth discipline really is systems thinking. And so systems thinking is very important. And that's really understanding that anything that you change in a systemic context impacts everything else. So you can't change anything in a system without everything having a subsequent reaction to that. So it's sort of the ripple effect. And so you got to be able to understand how systems thinking works, and you have to understand how to identify the root causes, because a lot of times we're reacting to symptoms of things that are not really the root cause of what the problem is. And so in the book, The Fifth Discipline, Peter Senge spends a fair amount of time talking about the concept of systems thinking that organizations have to be able to do. And they also have to be able to become very good at and effective at identifying root causes, and not just being distracted by symptomatology that sometimes does distract us, and it doesn't allow us to drill down to the core problem that's causing the problem, the core issue that's causing the problem.
Does it feel always supposed to have root cause analysis?
Say that again.
Does it feel always supposed to have root cause analysis after the accident or incident that happens?
Hold 1 second. Okay, one more time. Can you repeat that question? I was getting some feedback from the other system.
Yes, does it feel always supposed to have root cause analysis after the accident or incident happened with the patient?
I'm still not getting that clearly.
I'm gonna write it down, okay?
Write it down and I'll look at the comment. That's Esther, right? Somebody else has raised their hand, or just jump in. You don't have to raise your hand, just jump in and make a comment.
Just
Whoever wants to.
a couple of quick comments.
All right, David,
So-
I hear you clearly.
Okay, well, thank you for your thoughts. A couple of different reactions. One, so in part in human factors, I mean, it's a common term and it's not unusual in a lot of disciplines, but the concept of resilience. So how do you build in resilience? How do you, we're often thrown into situations where we have to be reactive. So the pandemic, no one was prepared. Certainly University Hospital Brooklyn wasn't prepared. It couldn't be. The circumstances were just beyond our control. Hopefully those are in the minority of cases. But so how do you build resilience? And I think so it's a complex concept, but I think having that data at hand and being data-driven in your changes, I think can potentially make an enormous difference in terms of building resilience. So you have a pool in which to create, which in effect creates a body of evidence that informs how can you act more effectively in the future. There's also a concept of a learning healthcare system, which is embraced in various ways. And it's the big challenge in doing that is really getting the data. So it's typically, oriented to an institution like a hospital. And so hospitals can adjust, they can get to know their patient populations. For example, a drug for patient with diabetes may not work well with a particular segment, a certain older segment. And so they could learn that from their data. They could study that. There are lots and lots of questions you could ask, not only clinical ones, but personnel ones, et cetera, that makes a difference. So I think those driving, data driving factors can make an enormous difference in the lifeblood of an institution and for each of us personally.
Absolutely. Yeah, for just a comment, follow up on that, David, two great points there. Resilience is the concept of, resilience still is, it's a concept that's somewhat clear, but we don't know exactly what constitutes resilience a lot of times, because resilience is it really speaks to, two people on a micro level, two people who are exposed to the same risk, and one of them gets caught up in the negativity that's associated with those risks, and one of them is immune to those risks, so to speak. Two young people living in the hood with crime and violence and drug dealing around them all the time. One does well, one doesn't. And the research says it's things like mentoring, bonding with other positive people, having a good home environment. And so at the organizational level, obviously those resilience is probably less well understood, but I think you're right. If we could somehow build resilience into organizations so they sort of bounce back more so when these unanticipated things happen, like the COVID pandemic, who could have anticipated that? But we learn going forward. So now that we've had this pandemic, and I guess you could made the argument that we've had other epidemics, maybe not pandemics previously. And so that's part of our landscape of things that can happen. So you try to think ahead of those things, but you can't think of it all and you don't expect it all to happen. So you're right. If we can build that resilience, it would be very much to the advantage of the organization to be able to be more nimble and stay on balance. And of course, data is obviously a great thing. The only problem with data is that data is on things we've already experienced. And so we try to use data to forecast for the future, but data is really primarily based on what's already happened. And so it's the patterns of things that have happened previously. Then we try to build on that for the future and maybe do some forecasting. But I think you're right. In the absence of a lot of other concrete tools, data is really a great thing to do. And I think I said that too, data-driven decision-making is really a way to be more forward-thinking and proactive in any organization's lifespan. Other comments from folks? I didn't get the message written down.
I have a question.
Somebody wrote. The lady who I couldn't understand her book. Go ahead.
I have a question. Will we be receiving like a recording, I guess an email of recording, because some of it went in and out during the time I was on my way home?
Yeah.
Okay.
Franchon typically sends a recording to everybody who attends the sessions. And she'll send an evaluation. And if there's any sometimes I have handouts and she'll send those as well. Don't have one for this particular session. Although I will say there's an article that was published, I published some years ago, that really hits most of the lecture topics in this overall series that we'll make available at some point.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. The young lady, I think her name was Esther, who was on here earlier that I couldn't hear. Can you try to restate your question now? It seems like the audio is a little clearer because I haven't seen that you've written it in the chat. Was it Esther who was here earlier?
It was
and asked me a question several times and I couldn't hear it.
Esther, she put it in the chat, but I think she sent it only to me.
Okay, can you read it for us? Would you be willing to read it for us?
Hold on, give me a second.
Because I
Um,
don't see it in the chat.
I'm not quite sure exactly what she was asking. I'll read it as she wrote it.
Okay.
Does it we always supposed to have root cause analysis after anything happens with a patient? Or if bad outcomes occur occasionally in the same area? She also says not everyone collects data correctly.
Right. Yeah. So thank you very much for reading that. So yes, root cause, I would say error on the side of always trying to do root cause analysis. Now, whether you can do it successfully in every situation, who knows? But I think if you're doing any kind of analysis of what went wrong in a given situation, then it should be a root cause analysis to try to not just be distracted by symptoms of what the problem is, but try to do that root cause digging to get down, drill down to what that core issue is that's causing the things to go awry. And what was the second part again? What was the second thing that she said in her question?
She says, or if bad outcomes occur occasionally in the same area.
I think she said something about data too, right? And something
She
about
says
data.
everyone
Yeah.
doesn't collect data correctly.
Right. So we'll have a session on data-driven decision making, but you're right. Data only helps if it's done in a systematic and intentional way, and people who are doing the data collection and setting up the data systems for that collection to occur have some knowledge and background that allows it to happen in an effective way. You're right. You got to know what you're doing when you're setting up a data system for data-driven decision making. So absolutely. Thank you again for sharing her observations. Other comments and questions from anyone? Is there anyone who wants me to go back over any portion of the recorded piece that wasn't clear to you at this point? Because I know we had all the technical challenges throughout.
Well,
okay.
I would, to see if I understand this correctly, I'd like to simplify what you're saying and put it into this perspective of how we work in the hospital in a code.
Sure.
Adaptive, you have adaptive versus generative, and I'd like to say that generative is having those code drills in the hospital with your team, where when something happens, we already anticipated it and everyone knows their part. But in
Right.
adaptive, no one really knows their part, so it takes a little bit more time for all the key players to get into play and get the problem solved. So when you have a code, that makes the difference sometimes between life and death, because the generative, everyone already knew their part, and we could get this patient back where they belong in a much faster time than the adaptive, where everyone's now learning their part in the actual crisis.
Right. Yeah, adaptive, you're basically flying by the seat of your pants and learning as you go and doing a lot of improvisation and hoping you get it right. And that can work if you got a very nimble and agile team. And as David mentioned, if you have a lot of resilience and in history, we're dealing with challenges of the same nature and magnitude, that can work, but it's obviously not ideal. The more you can anticipate what those challenges are and have gone through a process of, so to speak, rehearsing and running through how you would respond, the better off you'll be in that response. But obviously you can't anticipate everything. So it is going to be always a mixed bag, and every organization is going to have a mixture of both adaptive and generative learning. But you want to push the balance toward more generative as much as you can, because that's the learning that, as you just said, that you've rehearsed and you're ready for. And so you can pretty much feel like the process is going to play out the way that it should, because you've already anticipated that one. But there will always be adaptive learning, because there are always things that come out of left field that we had not expected and we are not necessarily fully prepared for, but we do have to deal with it nevertheless. So absolutely. Yeah, so none of this is going to be a perfect process, but it really is just a way to sort of position, both anticipating the future and building a learning organization, just a few strategies to sort of position yourself in the case of anticipating the future in a given discipline or profession, or in a learning organization to position the organization to be more likely to be able to be inclined toward proactivity, as opposed to always being off balance and always having to react to things that happen to it. But it's not a perfect process or prescription that always is going to lead to success. So it's just an inclination that makes you a little more ready to be forward thinking and proactive. So it's, yeah. And oftentimes organizations that are learning organizations, even though they're learning generatively, they don't really know what the key ingredients were or the recipe was. They can't unbundle that and say, we did well in this situation because of X, Y, and Z. And an example I give is, years ago, many of you may know of, maybe familiar with the old Mazda Miata car, Mazda Miata, which is a small two-seater car that typically convertible. That Mazda years ago, they attributed that particular car hitting the marketplace through generative learning. Although none of their focus groups, none of their key informant interviews, none of their forecasting with their customers indicated that would be a car that the Mazda customer group would embrace. But as it turned out, they were able to develop that car, and they were able to basically anticipate something that customers would like before the customers were able to articulate that they would like that. And so it was basically, in a sense, happenstance that they created that particular vehicle, and it was a huge success. Now, if you look at BMW and Mercedes, there are a lot of car manufacturers have emulated that Mazda Miata from back, I think it was in the 80s early to mid 80s when it first came out, and they attribute that to generative learning, although they can't unpack that and tell you exactly what they did to come up with it. It was just something that happened, and they were ahead of the curve. They anticipated customer desires and wishes before the customers could even articulate it, because none of their research and development and market analysis and their data collection activities indicated that would be a success before they launched that vehicle. So sometimes it is a bit of a mystery. But if you can do the personal mastery, the team learning, the team visioning, and the root cause analysis, and really try to perfect systems thinking, and also do the data-driven decision making, and also include the resilient stuff that David Kaufman just mentioned, it certainly does improve the chances of you being able to be a little more proactive in how you function as an organization. But it won't guarantee that you'll always be able to function in a proactive, generative kind of way. There are no panaceas and silver bullets that always work. In the human endeavors, and we're talking about things that involve human beings. So there's always going to be that X factor that you can't account for before you see it. Other comments, questions, or anything else that people want me to go back to that was unclear or you didn't hear well because of the technical difficulties in this process today? Anyone? Still have 32 people here, so I've assumed somebody has a comment. Doesn't have to be a question, it could be a comment, observation, could be a criticism, could be whatever you want it to be. We're open to everything. We are in an academic environment, so there are no absolute rights and wrongs for this kind of a conversation, and people are free to voice their perspectives, and we would appreciate that.
Can you elaborate more on the innovation, on the fringe of professionalism?
Yeah, so that's anticipating the future. So the concept there is looking for innovation. So if you are in let's just say you're a nurse, and so that's because that's many nurses in the hospital. So if your discipline is as a nurse, maybe you're a nurse anesthetist or a nurse practitioner or RN or LPN, and you are involved, say you have a little group of colleagues, and you all are trying to be leaders in your profession, in the nursing profession, and figure out what the next great innovation will be within nursing. You're not going to look for that innovation in the national or regional or statewide nursing organizations, because in those organizations, that's where the established thinkers are going to be. That's where the status quo resides, in the center of those traditional, long-standing entities within the nursing profession. You're probably going to be better served if you situate yourself so that you have an understanding of what's happening in other healthcare professions. So you want to go to the fringe. In other words, you want to go to if you think about a circle, you want to go to the edge of that circle where nursing bumps up against medicine in terms of physicians, or bumps up against physician assistants, or bumps up against pharmacy, or bumps up against physical therapy, and all the many health professions that are involved in providing healthcare. Because when you have that vantage point to be able to look over in those other disciplines, that's when you're going to have that cross-fertilization, that exposure to different concepts that may be useful in your own nursing discipline, but you got to be in that position to see it. And then that will make your ideas a little more innovative, as opposed to just being in the center of the nursing organization, where all the people, they only see the world through the traditional nursing lens. The worldview is the traditional nursing way of seeing things. You need a more multiple perspective in terms of worldviews and other disciplines to be able to generate that innovative idea that's going to really be an earth-shaking positive change in your discipline.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So the innovation typically comes from the edge, where you have the vantage point to see into other areas.
Okay.
You think about it. If I say, let's solve this medical problem, and I got 10 nurses in a room to figure out what the way to solve this problem is, they're all going to come up with a nursing strategy, because they're all trained the same way. Even though they're different people, they may be very creative, but they all see the world through the same
way,
nursing prism, right? But if I say, let's solve the same problem, but we're going to have 2 nurses, 2 physical therapists, 2 pharmacists, 2 physicians, 2 occupational therapists, 2 respiratory therapists, I'm willing to bet that the answer that comes from that mixed group is going to be much more innovative and interesting, and perhaps more successful than just the group of people who are all the same, who have the same background and training.
Okay.
That's the idea. You want to make sure that you're influenced by those other disciplines. So you got to go to the fringe of your professional discipline to see those other disciplines.
Okay.
Yeah. Other comments, questions? That was a very good question. Yeah, thank you for that. Other comments,
Thank you.
questions?
That was a very good explanation. I appreciate that. That was very good. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Once in a while, I can do that. Not always.
No, it just makes sense, because you're right. We just stick to our own profession and we don't really look outside, and that's why we can move past certain things, because we're just used to doing things the way they are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And within a given profession, we all have a certain amount of like-mindedness, because we're all trained and socialized the same way,
Right.
within the same profession.
Yeah.
So it's that's why interprofessional education, interprofessional collaboration is so important, because you get the mixed perspectives and the mixed ideologies in there.
Right. Yeah.
Other comments, questions?
Yeah. Hi, it's Shirley Gerard. Alan,
Hey,
good
Shirley.
to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thank you for always being so supportive of these things.
Oh, well, these are important concepts for all of us, I think. I just wanted to comment, and I think there are some leaders within disciplines who are able to see things differently and do sort of shake the trees and make things different. I think it has to do with our education, it has to do with our experiences, but I belong to some renegade groups, as would be no surprise to anyone else. And I certainly find some of those groups are very creative. I myself, I'm involved in a lot of policy work these days, and I find that it's very helpful for me in those roles to be able to see things through lots of people's different eyes. Even if I don't agree with them, it does give me a different perspective. And it may be my policy work and my political work that's caused me to try to consider every other angle that's possible on things. Not that I don't sometimes still get surprised, but I think there are people that can think differently too.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And we'll talk in one of our later sessions about critical thinking. I think that's part of critical thinking. People who are very well trained and astute at critical thinking always have the ability to think about, okay, we're looking at this one way, but there are at least 3 or 4 other ways we can look at this. And it also has to do with what you read, I think. One of the things I've noticed is that people who read in different disciplines, even in their leisure reading, if you don't always read in your discipline, and you don't always read, say novels or whatever, but you read, technical magazines and different newspapers and outside of your discipline, I think that gives you that inclination to be a little more innovative in how you approach things as well. So, so there's some things you can do to improve your ability to be a little more creative and innovative, read more broadly across, discipline-based lines and that kind of thing, and hone in on your critical thinking skills. So you can always think of the other argument that can be made, the counter argument to whatever position you take. those kinds of things. But you're right. A lot of the leaders who do come up with innovative and creative ideas are not necessarily on the fringe. They could be very much in the center of a given profession, but they have somehow situated themselves and equipped themselves with the ability to see other perspectives and to really have that innovative sort of orientation. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, Shirley. You do a lot of that. You're really good at that. And you travel in a lot of different circles, which I think is part of that, which helps that. Obviously, yeah. You don't just hang out with a bunch of nurses all the time. Which is nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't, enrich
Some of
your
my best
perspective.
friends, some of my best friends are nurses.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's great comment there, observation. Anybody else? We're down to 3 minutes. So, anybody else have anything you want to throw into the mix? We still have 30 folks here, so we have, in a couple of minutes, if anybody wants to throw anything into the mix. Anyone?
Thank you for great presentation.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for putting up with the technical issues. We'll have to really do better next time. And thank you, David, for that tip on making sure I wasn't quite as mumbled. I may have to back off this pre-recorded option and maybe just start doing everything live, which was the original plan. But when we were all virtual, I had lots of technical issues, so we did the pre-recording. So we'll see. It'll get better.
You actually sound great live.
Yeah. All right. So next time I'll do it live then. Thank you. And we will send out an evaluation, and we'll send the recording, and we'll see what happens. See everybody hopefully next month at whatever the topic. I don't remember what the topic is for next month, but it'll be something interesting, hopefully. And thank you again, and everybody stay well and be safe.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.